So, welcome back to 3rd Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another battle on the test build of the upcoming new patch. And this is another one with a distinctly elven theme for the defenders here, with all of the elven architecture and elven factions taking to the defence, albeit this time around it's going to be with more traditional opponents for them, with the dwarves no longer indulging in their more evil thoughts perhaps. All of the factions on the attack this time are orcs, and having a look at this settlement there are plenty of options for the defenders as well. We do have some good outer choke points with the fortifications included, but also as they retreat further backwards the architecture, the buildings and also the topography of this location are also going to be pretty good for the elves to dig in. The snow is pretty damn bright, I mean, I don't have any visual mods actually installed in Medieval 2 anymore, so this is just the base game being a little bit fluorescent. In the past it used to be SweetFX causing this problem. I'll see what I can do after filming the intro about maybe trying to turn the aggression of this down, albeit YouTube does a fairly decent job. It's one way in which their video compression actually does perhaps help a little bit, but yes, the elves on the defence, some good positions. 4v4, the quality of the elves in this sort of situation can really do a lot of the hard yards for them, but even in 4v4s the defenders often have a bit of an uphill battle, especially when it comes to the numbers that the attackers can often bring to bear, and we'll get right on with that now. It is going to be a distinctly orcish feeling to the attackers, starting off with Nick MMK over here playing as Isengard. Of all of the attackers, they probably have a little bit more of a focus on the quality of some of their mid to upper tier units as part of their core infantry. Speaking of which, the Uruk-hai infantry are really the centre of that, especially in this kind of battle where in melee their quality is better than most of the other orcish factions, especially when it comes to dealing damage. Angmar have got some equivalency there, but it's still not quite on the level all round of the Uruk-hai infantry, even if they can match Isengard defensively in that regard. And that's really the key here. Isengard have got the good armour, they're going to be able to absorb punishment even from the elves with their high damage. They're going to take losses of course, but they're going to be able to mitigate that better perhaps than some of the other units on the field today. But also they're going to be able to do a decent amount of damage in return as well once they actually get into melee, provided they don't take damage too quickly of course. It's what gives Isengard their feel of course, but one thing that is worth saying of course is that Isengard do have more cost involved with them as well, so they may not have the same level of numbers as their allies today, albeit the Uruk-hai raiders here can provide some more numbers for them. More leather armour over here though, so it's going to mean that those elven projectiles are going to be able to deal a lot of damage, but they're numerous, and that's the key. That balance is going to be very, very important for the attackers to strike here. Uruk-hai infantry once again, there's a gap here. Uruk-hai raiders still there, so more infantry like we just mentioned. We also have the Uruk-hai reavers. Good amount of damage off them. The armour piercing against elven factions is very variable in terms of how much mileage you're going to get out of it, and even against Imladris, where it's at its most useful, the relative quality between the units and the really low melee defense that basic orc axemen like this tend to have means that they end up melting away pretty quickly regardless. But if you can combine them with the more defensive units Isengard have, it's still going to be a useful edge to their army, and they don't have to get too many kills in order to be able to be worthwhile in this kind of situation, so that is worth saying. But they're also going to be very vulnerable of course to enemy projectiles. More Uruk-hai raiders, another gap. We can't see who's going to be in these gaps. We've got some more Uruk-hai infantry, so dipping pretty heavily into the mainline units that Isengard have. More reavers. The slightly retooled guards of Orthanc, now they're a more numerous non-bodyguard unit, more akin to something like the Minas Morgul chosen from Mordor, who we may be seeing in just a moment. Just a high-end, really good, solid defensive spear unit. They're actually going to be even better at absorbing punishment than the Uruk-hai infantry, though of course they will lack a little bit of the damage dealing capability, so they're not going to get huge amounts of kills against the skill that the elves do possess, but their ability to absorb punishment better than many of the other units, even among Isengard, is going to be important. Now Orthanc plate armour will definitely earn its keep if they can keep Isengard fighting long term. Uruk-hai pikemen, however, may be able to do that even more so. The only downside to them, of course, is the fact that missiles will be pretty effective against them, even with the Uruk-hai armour that they do wear. Unfortunately, the lack of a shield against the deadly elven arrows is going to be a problem for them, but if they move forward at the right time, they can really anchor not just Isengard's force, but the attackers in general in place. And ultimately their armour is going to be useful if it does come down to a scrap, especially late on. Trolls of the White Hand, we know how effective trolls can be in this version of the game, and it's actually one of the ways in which the attackers could really gain some momentum as the fight gets underway, though the elves, I think, are better suited than most to deal with trolls. Even though they have been buffed pretty significantly, trolls, in terms of their survivability, the elves do still have the damage in melee to be able to hack them down pretty quickly if they get isolated, if they get a bit too greedy. Isengard Ballista, I think this might be the first time we're seeing the Isengard Ballista in this version of the game, albeit it hasn't really changed at all. The crew has, a little bit more numerous, a little bit more armoured, but they themselves are kind of like diet versions of Uruk-hai infantry, more akin perhaps to Uruk-hai crossbowmen in melee. So not going to be as effective perhaps as we saw the Númenórean trebuchet crew be, but still a little bit better than they were. And of course the Isengard Ballista itself is very, very deadly. If the elves take up the wrong position on a hill that's exposed, it's the sort of thing which can lay down an awful lot of punishment very, very quickly. 2 units of Uruk-hai crossbowmen flanking a unit of Uruk-hai archers. The archers really just here to make up the numbers and maybe trade in a token gesture with the elven archers, who will dominate them of course. But the crossbows are more of a problem. The elves do need to try and focus them down if they are able, because if they do get in range, a few volleys is often all it takes for the attackers to really swing a battle in their favour, if they can get the right sight line of course. And then the Nazkai, the very pinnacle of Isengard infantry, still their bodyguard, very, very big damage values on them, armour piercing as well, which like we said is kind of variable in its effectiveness, but scary even for the elves. The second attacking force, we have Angmar. Good thing that we are talking about them immediately, because they bear the most similarity perhaps with Isengard, Panthan and Barsoom playing as them. Upgraded armour on the Guardians of Kharn-dûm. We mentioned them kind of offhandedly when talking about the Uruk-hai infantry. The main difference is that the Guardians are more defensively focused, perhaps. A bigger shield, especially when you upgrade their armour, they can be a real metal brick of units that move towards your line, but they're not going to be quite as effective at dealing damage as the Uruk-hai infantry. But perhaps you could argue that the defensive stats are the important thing. You just need to keep the fires lit, as it were, as the attackers, and Angmar can certainly do that. It's very difficult to make them go away. Just in behind them we have a very similar story as well with the Witch Realm pikemen, so kind of a similar feel to both forces. Isengard perhaps can have a little bit more variation with their mid-tier, but ultimately at the centre of both armies, solid unit of pikes in behind a solid unit of line infantry, something which the other Orcish factions maybe lack a little bit more so. But it is worth saying that Angmar cannot back this up with crossbows, but they do back it up with even more scary units when it comes to being hyper-aggressive. The Blackwatch Legion with their mass-pushing capabilities, very deadly, especially against the elves. The elves, of course, less mass just because there are less of them, so they need to make sure that their front lines are solid enough to be able to withstand that classic Angmar bludgeon. The Witches are also here. They're a little bit toned down from what they were in the last version of the game, but that doesn't make them much less scary. If they get a few good volleys off, especially on clustered units of defenders, it can often be leaving the opposition with an insurmountable task in front of them. We'll see if that's the case here. Of course, they can be focused down relatively easily by projectiles. The Witch Realm Hammerguard are pretty similar to the Nazkai as well, so similar feels so far, though as we get into the mounted units that will change. Big armour piercing damage once more. The Scourge Raiders I think are actually a good pick, because it does make the prospect of a sally out less scary if the elves do choose to go for that again, and the Scourge Raiders with their throwing axes can be useful even if they get used purely for their projectiles, maybe for a bit of extra mass to see the attackers over the line. We've got standard Warg Riders to help out with that, and also going in for some Trolls of Angmar, so some fairly expensive units here from Panthan, maybe less numerous as an army, but scary. It's the sort of army where if you use it all in one go at the critical moment, it can be very, very effective, but if it peters out, it may ultimately end up being an expensive waste. Now then, we have a second Isengard army under Adin's command, so we have some Uruk-hai Reavers. Go through this one a little bit more quickly, seeing as we've seen most of these units before. More Uruk-hai archers, the pikemen are at the centre of the situation once again. Again, more of those axemen, interesting choice given the elven opposition. More Trolls of the White Hand, going for the Champions of the White Hand as well, so a cavalry presence that is not insignificant from the attackers here. Some big money being spent on these units, but again, we saw that last time around. Can that be a difference maker? We've got some Nazkai and also some Uruk-hai Berserkers, maybe a fairly expensive unit to bring, considering they're often better against more armour-only focused factions, and once their hit points do degrade, they are fairly easy pickings for archers and more skilled units. But the damage spike they offer is tempting, especially considering the amount of hit points they do have. They can last for a decent amount of time. And finally, Tommy, playing as Mordor, more numerous, perhaps less mid-tier available to them, but they do have very numerous low-end units and some very strong high-end units. So some orc fodder for the numbers. The Uruk infantry, of course, not on the same level as the equivalent line infantry that we've seen from Isengard and Angmar, but there are more of them, which is the key, and going more numbers heavy, considering the Angmar approach is probably the way to go to make things balanced among the attackers. Troll drummers, the Olag Higher at the centre of things, obviously the strongest singular unit of trolls that the game has to offer. Very, very scary, as we have seen in the past. Uruk chieftains are over there, looks like there's several bodyguard units on display. Temple executioners are there also with their long swords, so some good quality units there. It looks like javelins as well, low end, but again it's a real puzzle to work out what to do with them unless you can cavalry charge them. There's no way to deal with them super efficiently. The Beasts of Gorgoroth, once again, we've seen them be very effective. The javelins they throw, a nice little bonus, and of course the mass is a real problem. The elves will have to be very ready for some hyper-aggression here from the attackers. Morgul Chosen, similar to the new Guards of Orthanc, they though haven't really changed. Very heavily armoured, good defensively, not really the best at dealing damage, so they won't get a huge amount of kills, but they will keep the Mordor front line in good shape. The Nazgul, of course, individually speaking, will be the strongest unit on the field, but there are only 10 of them, so they need to be used accordingly, sequestered away within the rest of the Mordor ranks. Temple Guard with their armour-piercing arrows. This is a fairly high-quality Mordor army, in all fairness, so there's only so much they're going to be able to push, but the Blackguard of Barad-dûr as well, more mass pushing, so they have got all that they need to be hyper-aggressive here. It's not the longest 4v4, I must say, so maybe that's what the attackers will do. Starting off then with the first of the defenders, Dabo, who is the one who sent me this battle replay, so big thank you to him, playing as Lothlorien, so of course the damage Lothlorien can deal is significant. The Kindred of Celeborn now a closer range unit with their throwing axes, which I think is a good change. It gives Lothlorien a little bit more close range punch, which will be useful for trying to break up some of the scary pushes that we may see from the attackers. And of course in melee there's still going to be a real tour de force as well. Very similar as well, we have the Galathrim Axemen, which also now have a throwing projectile, as well as being the higher end line infantry unit that Lothlorien can base their front lines around. Good to see them. Lorien Spearmen are more basic. Again, there's only 133 of them per unit and they're relatively lightweight, but as the elves you often have to bring some of these entry level units. If it comes down to pure melee, they can be surprisingly efficient in a honourable frontline fight, but of course if it does come down to mass pushing, that isn't really where their expertise lies. We've got Galathrim Spearmen in there as well. We have the Galathrim Riders, very strong unit of horse archers of course with their silver thorns, but I don't know if they'll be well served sallying out in this situation given the presence of all the Angmar cavalry with those champions from Isengard as well. Could be a little bit of a problem for them. More Galathrim Axemen, so all of the damage dealing capabilities you'd expect. Plenty of these Lorien Spearmen as the centre of this Lorien effort. There's also some Galathrim Warriors crouching down in the grass. That armour piercing will be universally useful against any orcish faction, of course. Lorien Archers are in there. Of course, Lothlorien don't lack for ranged punch, and that will be very important to the defenders universally here. Galathrim Archers also add in some pretty good melee expertise as well, which is always important for the defenders. Their archers will need to muck in melee at some point. There's probably other Lothlorien units in there as well, perhaps the Rangers, who may very well be hidden. Onto the second army, which is another Lothlorien army actually. This one a little bit more widespread, so we can see more units from T.S. Niehoff. Speaking of which, we have the Guardians of Caras Galadhon. Very, very powerful unit, of course. When it comes to digging in, it's the singularly most defensive unit of pikes that the game has to offer because of their multiple HP. Albeit the Dwarven pikes do have a little bit more damage, but we'll see. We'll see how they get on here. At least I assume this is still the case. Lorien Spearmen, here we do have the Rangers. Nice to see them in full view. Relatively plain as far as they go, but Rangers in this version of the game are still very, very powerful. They may not be the be-all and end-all now, because their body piercing has now gone, but the damage they can do against the right kind of units is still absolutely key, especially for defenders' chances of winning in these kind of battles. 2 units of Galathrim Axemen. Got the Galathrim Nobles here, the foot-based version of the Riders, which we saw in the last army and just in behind them as well. Probably Lothlorien's most powerful melee combatant as well, which is important to note. Sindar Blade Masters in behind. This is the heavy swordsman unit. All elven factions have got effective heavy swordsmen dedicated, and this is the sort of unit which can be very, very good against Orcish forces. Several of them, more Galadhrim Axemen, more Galadhrim Archers as well, who are technically heavy swordsmen in melee as well, just not quite as powerful as the dedicated variant, but the multifaceted nature of them is going to be important here. As we move on, we come across Rohan, actually, interestingly enough, so they've come to the aid of the elves today, and actually the armour piercing that Rohan have more universally than any of the elven factions is actually going to be a real boon, I think, on the defence today. We saw Rohan recently try to take a Dunland fort and narrowly fail. We'll see if they have any better luck on the defence. Westmark Marshals should be very, very good against the forces of the attackers today. Obviously their sworn enemies in Isengard will be across the way from them today. Javelins, even basic javelins like these Eastmark spearmen, will do the business as long as they have enough opportunities to throw their projectiles, much like the Orc javelins, kind of the same sort of thing. Dwarven catapulting in amongst things, so this is, I guess, an analogous to the Dwarves of the Glittering Caves, so nice for Rohan to have yet another solid unit of infantry ultimately, as well as a very potent artillery piece. Lords of the Mark, I think, are the pure lance cavalry option that Rohan have, so I don't know if they're going to be able to gain much either. I mean, if they sally out too early, they're going to get swamped, but late on, perhaps, some cycle charging, some hammer and anvil, that could be a real match-winning unit. We've got the Shield Maidens, who in the last version of the game were one of the few bright sparks for Rohan. They will still, of course, maintain their important position at the centre of Rohan's roster just because axe throwers are so effective, but the rest of Rohan around them, hopefully with some good cavalry performances here, we can show that they are a little bit stronger now. Red Shields of Erkenbrand, a more defensive unit of horse archers, melee cavalry, as well as, of course, being that heavier horse archer as well. Helmingas for skirmishing. We've got a few Riddermark axemen in there as well for the more basic armour piercing. Plenty of axes sticking out, all of the Rohirrim also in a bit of a blob, so it's kind of hard to differentiate them. There's some Westmark spearmen in there, and I'd be surprised if there were no Westmark infantry also to be that more solid frontline unit. And finally, the Elves of Mirkwood, played by Hidden, so all Sylvan Elves today, as opposed to the all High Elves in the very last replay, so we'll see how they get on. Hiri Lung, Mirkwood, of course, well known for being very damaging as well as Lothlorien, albeit with less armour piercing perhaps, but maybe even more of a focus around archery. The Hiri Peng, also much like the Elven archers that we've already seen, very powerful at range, but also very able in melee as well when they pull out their two-handed sword. Just in behind we have the Elder Royal Council, another specialty projectile unit, Silverthorns all round, so that may be a way to also try and break up any mass pushes that the attackers attempt. We shall see. We've got the Elder Pathfinders and some Mirkwood Border Guard. Interesting to see the Elven Horse Archers as well as the Pathfinders here, formerly Sindar of the Girdle. Again, big cavalry presence on this battle, which that is going to determine an awful lot because both sides have invested so much that whoever gets the better of that will be hoping that they can then impact the infantry fight accordingly. Elven King's Guard with, of course, their two-handed axes as well as their abilities at range. Elder Council for some javelins. The heavy core of Mirkwood, or at least as heavy as Mirkwood can go. The Hiri Lung and Hiri Ek, obviously, once again, the heavy swordsmen of the elves. And then, I mean, to be fair, even though Mirkwood maybe prioritise armour a little bit less, the shields from the front anyway of the Hiri Ek are very, very effective indeed. Various levels of armour upgrade depending on what Hidden could afford. Elder Council, once again, an Elven King's Guard. So unsurprisingly, Mirkwood going quality heavy as the elves often tend to do. But I'll make a little bit of a cut. I don't think there'll be too much of one. I think the attackers will move forward fairly quickly. It's not going to be the longest battle, this. I think it's going to be very full-blooded from both sides, and we'll see who gets the better of that, whether it's the heavy and numerous nature of the orcs, or whether it's the finesse and skill of the elves with a little bit of Rohirric gumption thrown in, shall we say. But yes, I'll make a cut and we shall rejoin when the battle is about to begin. So I think we will rejoin just here, even though the first blood has not yet been spilled, mainly because there is this little eccentricity of this map where there's a bit of high ground that the attackers can march through. I don't think this is going to be good enough for the Isengard forces to get their crossbows in a really devastating position against Rohan, but I think their archers will be in range, so It'll make life a little bit more interesting with regards to the archer-on-archer combat, but again, Eastmark archers, Uruk-hai archers, not really the most important units in the world, though skirmishers like this are going to be more of a factor for the defenders. It'll be Helmingas where Rohan can really put down a marker long range against their foes. Meanwhile, the Mirkwood Border Guard are firing away and inflicting the first casualties on the map as we're talking about that, against the advancing Mordor forces. Now, if the Uruk archers can get into position, they should be able to trade reasonably efficiently with the very light elven archers, but of course that interim where they have to get into range first is the problem. Each of those elven arrows that does strike is very likely to result in a kill because of their high damage. You can see the Morgul Chosen moving forward, who will stand a much better chance at withstanding those strikes. Meanwhile, Khan Doom Guardians also on the move forward. Angmar, I should say, always the scary force that they are on the attack. Further up, however, Lothlorien, in many ways one of the scariest defending forces as well. They have that elven skill, but they also have the ability to deal a lot of damage very quickly, not only with their long-range archers, but now also those throwing axes give them a real edge to them. It does also differentiate them a little bit more from Imladris now. Imladris may have a little bit more solidity to them up front, but Lothlorien's damage, there is something to be said for that, especially when you have to crunch your way through the kind of defences that Angmar do pack on. Though even these elven archers will have issues getting through the big shields on the Guardians of Khan'dun, and certainly the Blackwatch Legion, one of the most heavily shielded units the game has to offer. The other Isengard army got a little bit further to go before they start encountering elves of their own, one of the Lothlorien armies on the field. Of course, the temptation would be to condemn Rohan as the weak link here, but we'll have to wait and see, because their armour piercing that is spread throughout their army is going to be pretty useful against Isengard. But the first melee engagement here, the elves, spears down, getting that engagement going against the Orc fodder, and they are going to need some extra support on the front line pretty quickly here, the Orc fodder. The solid elven spears backed up by the damage dealing potential of these dual wielding axemen. But, you know, they're going to get ripped apart very, very quickly. And as if that wasn't enough, also got the Silverthorn arrows from in behind, the Elven King's Guard taking a few pot shots. I mean, the Beasts of Gorgoroth are in the background, which is a bit of a concern. Their javelins are being used first and foremost to try and do some damage here against the Elven King's Guard, who are also in a pretty nasty position. Just in general, this kind of firing lane where the archers can get parallel to infantry can be really damaging, but Mordor doing the right thing really in trying to mitigate the effectiveness of those elven archers. Forward come the Uruk infantry. The issue thus far is going to be that Mordor simply aren't going to have the ability to force the issue on this front line. Flaming shot as well, trying to speed Mordor's retreat. Also, well, the Uruk-hai Reavers routing with almost immediate effect in the face of this Rohan front line, although Isengard's force may be a little bit stretched over here. Obviously, as the attackers, if you get all of your army into this position, it does expose them an awful lot to all of Rohan's support, but the other side of that argument is what you see just there, where the Uruk-hai Reavers had no support of their own and got very quickly routed as a result of javelins and archers being in close proximity of a well-prepared spear defence. And the Westmark spears will be just fine. It says defeat seems certain, but that won't be the case. They will have the ability to overcome the half-orc spear guard, especially with a bit of support nearby. This unit of Eastmark archers has taken a lot of damage, presumably at the hands of those Uruk-hai archers just behind. Trolls of the White Hand also on the way forward. I think actually for the time being we will go down to half speed just for the moment, because things are kicking off all across the battlefield. But yeah, half-orc spear guard, a reasonably solid unit, and spear on spear battles often take a little while, but still. Another route potentially that Angmar can take over here, but Lothlorien with their Galadhrim Riders, and they do have a defence already prepared, so one unit of wargs is not going to be enough to cause this defence to completely fold. Karen Amroth Rangers arcing their shots a little bit. You don't really want that to be the case. Barrow Whites also, new model on them. Always going to be an awkward thing to try and deal with as defenders, because they simply aren't going to go away in any short amount of time, but Lothlorien perhaps do have damage where many don't. Angmar are actually the last ones in, amazingly enough, as Isengard do close the gap and are now engaging with Lothlorien on this front line over here. Though this is exactly the kind of engagement that these lighter elven units will enjoy. No sort of ranged units going after them. Everything focused around their better than most units in class abilities in melee. And they're not being completely overrun yet either. More numbers being added to the front line all the time, however. Uruk-hai Raiders, the latest to join in. Further along, still got those archers as well in support, but not yet being used to their fullest. Uruk-hai crossbows, the unit that was being targeted by the Galathrim, and rightly so. You can't allow those crossbows to get into position, even if it is against only your most basic units. It can be a bit of a concern. So still Angmar biding their time and waiting. Everyone else, however, very much involved. The trolls getting involved on the front line. The addition of the trolls and the advance of the pikemen, Rohan have answered that with some Riddermark axemen. That sort of armour-piercing damage will be vital. They're trying to do some damage to those trolls in melee, though perhaps not enough. Javelins also. Many of those javelins will actually connect with the trolls themselves. I mean, basic though they may be, Eastmark spearmen, basic javelins can be a really efficient tool. This, however, the Westmark Marshals, a higher tier unit of axemen, probably one of my favourite looking units in the game as well, actually. They will have a little bit more bite to them, and the trolls, some of those javelins will be hitting them as well, so it won't be the most comfortable engagement for them, but the trolls' newfound abilities, maybe it will be enough. Trying to get some crossbows in support as well, but much like against Lothlorien on the flank, Rohan not going to allow the crossbows completely free passage. They won't have the same ability to deal damage to them quickly that the elves do, but they are at least answering them in some capacity. Meanwhile over here, Mordor being the aggressor. It's Tommy. Any of the initial spear line have been whittled down a bit. Still the Beasts of Gorgoroth have not yet been committed. Good amount of damage done to those Elven King's Guard. The archers not really able to get into a great position. The Silverthorn arrows having to loop their shots, but they're still hitting Mordor units, and as much as they are making slow territorial gains, Mordor, it's going to be costing them an awful lot in terms of their manpower with all of these hits being scored. Well, that is most unfortunate. The Galathrim Riders caught out there by the Wargs, this one-to-one engagement. I mean, you would back the Galathrim Riders in this matchup, really, especially with a little bit of support coming in from those archers. The Wargs don't do particularly well under sustained arrow fire, but it hasn't gone particularly well there for a very high-ticket unit as well. Galathrim Riders, I mean, the Wargs are anti-cavalry, and you can see the damage they have done. Horse archers by trade as well, the Galathrim Riders, all of these factors in that perhaps, but if there is a silver lining to this, it's that the elves don't necessarily need their general to keep their morale together. But yeah, not great for them. Meanwhile, Angmar now getting into melee. We've got the Barrow-wights and Guardians of Kharn-Dûm, but right away on the front line are the Caras Galadon's Guardians. They will be helping to keep this front line rigid, and also moving into the front line are going to be the Galathrim Warriors. Two-handed axes, rarity among the elves, but a very valuable asset to have that kind of armour piercing against a faction like Angmar. And in particular, those Guardians of Kharn-Dûm will suffer at their hands, so no danger of Lothlorien's front line being crushed at this early stage of the battle. Axemen just in behind, plenty of reinforcements as well. Moving over here. This is the widest choke point, so Lorien do have quite a lot of territory to try and prevent Isengard from moving through, but that's only really a problem if Isengard come forward in the kind of numbers to be able to exploit that, and thus far they haven't. And indeed, where some of their front line has proven to be a little bit too flimsy, that we've had some routing. Uruk-hai Reavers coming forward with their axes, trying to do a little bit of extra damage. The Uruk-hai infantry now finding a gap. This is the kind of chaos that they do need to sow if they are to get any slightly more rapid gains than we've seen so far. Problem is though, the elves, even if you do expose their skirmishers, Lothlorien archers can definitely hold their own in melee, and 2 of them will be enough to deal with a unit of isolated Uruk-hai infantry, even with the infantry's good stats. Lothlorien archers, though, they would, if they do have ammunition, they would of course prefer to still be firing. Meanwhile, how is the Rohan front line doing? They do have the Dwarven catapult in place, so they feel the need to use their artillery. Artillery, actually, in the most recent battles we've seen, hasn't really been the most effective thing in the world. The great game of chance that you play with artillery, recently it seems that we haven't seen it at its very, very best. The Eastmark spearmen. I mean, you can see here that Isengard trying to force the issue. Westmark Marshals and Riddermark Axemen a little bit low in terms of numbers now. The Trolls still standing. The Guards of Orthanc being a solid defensive unit at the core of this Isengard push. A glancing blow on the Uruk-hai Berserkers, but the fact the Uruk-hai Berserkers are moving forward is a sign that Isengard really want to try and make this stick, and Rohan having to commit something like the Helm's Hammers to stem the bleeding a little bit. But to be fair, Rohan haven't fallen apart in the face of this aggression, and they still have plentiful manpower. I mean, they will have more in the tank in that regard than their elven compatriots today, so they do have that going for them. Catapult in a good place as well. Helmengas can get involved in melee as well, bit of a multifaceted unit in that regard. Dwarven catapult crew themselves actually will be a fairly effective infantry unit when the time comes. Are they going to be able to get a good shot? I mean, there's a column of pikes moving forward. A good blast into the middle of them would definitely not go amiss. I mean, these catapults are loaded, but are they actually going to fire? It's thinking about it. Well. Ooh, and here we can see as well, much like Isengard are making slightly slower progress, perhaps Mordor. They've been aggressive right from the off here, but now coming forward in a big way, trying to smash that initial front line to bits, and the combination of the Beasts of Gorgoroth and the Olag-hai, a very scary combination indeed. You need to go all in really to stop that sort of thing, and Mirkwood clearly didn't have the resources nearby to be able to do that. Mirkwood Border Guard and the Elder Pathfinders trying to pick off the Morgul Chosen as they charge through the gaps. I mean, that is the heart of the settlement right ahead that Mordor are looking at. Can they punch right on through? Still plenty of ammunition surely in reserve for Mirkwood. I mean, part of the issue here though is that Mordor still have enough in reserve to be a real problem. Blackguard of Barad-dûr still, plenty of mass pushing. And there goes the Rohirrim general. That, of all of the defending generals to lose, that would be the worst one, because Rohan are the most likely to rout as a result of such things. It's over on this side of the battle so far, where the attackers have taken damage, but they've certainly seized momentum. Is that going to be enough to see them through the entirety of the battle? We shall wait and see. Snaga skirmishers, Half-Orc Spearguard on the way forwards as well, throwing more and more forward. I think Isengard here, Adin's army, probably has less left in the tank than Tommy's does, but it's definitely worth keeping this going for as long as possible, putting that pressure on the defenders in a more combined fashion. Riddermark Axemen, again going after the Trolls. I mean, the Trolls surely must be pretty damaged at this point, and going after another unit of heavy Axemen will be a problem, and one of them actually getting hit directly by a catapult shot. Rohan's slightly more flimsy front line perhaps, contributing to the problems they're having, and the issue now is they don't really have an easy way to get support on the front line, and Isengard are now anchored in place by plentiful pikemen, so I think Rohan are going to be spinning their wheels a little bit for as long as this engagement now lasts. They do have Shield Maidens still in reserve. They still have a few units, but not too many, honestly. Worrying times. The Trolls and Angmar Marauders retreating as a result of this. This looks like a bit of a failure of an advance. Lothlorien managing to turn back another potential avenue of attack, but mainly Angmar were advancing up this route. Trolls also moving forward over here. You can see the difference in damage, however. The Trolls of Angmar, I mean, yes, the Trolls of Angmar individually are also not as strong as the Trolls of the White Hand of Isengard. But over here, those Elven Axemen, just in general, all of the Elven units with their better damage have managed to curtail the advance of the Trolls over here. Forward come more Barrow-wights and more Guardians of Kharn-Dûm, but Lothlorien on this side of the battlefield seem to have things a little bit more under control than Rohan and Mirkwood on the other side. There's one Troll left alive, incidentally, still going after those Galadhrim Axemen. Blackwatch Legion have pushed their way through the line at some point, but to what end I'm not sure. They have managed to disrupt the pike line, I suppose, but those heavy Axemen should make fairly quick work of them. Their mass and their big shield values really the selling point behind this unit, not their abilities in melee against something like them. Trolls of the White Hand have pushed their way through over here. I mean, to be fair, Isengard, you can see when they have come forward in numbers, they have managed to force Lothlorien back onto the defensive. Some of these units have retreated, in all fairness, but really it's only against Angmar, actually, where the defenders can be completely satisfied with their day's work so far, I think. They will be heavily reliant on their quality in the late game, I think, to see them over the line. Lorien archers getting hounded by these Trolls. I mean, these Trolls are bloodied, but it's not necessarily a sign that they're very close to death. And the Cairn Amroth Rangers, I mean, two-handed sword in melee, but you wouldn't choose to send them against Trolls. One of the Trolls falling to those throwing axes. Good amount of damage being done. In comes some Galadhrim Axemen as well. Will Lothlorien's damage be enough to dig them out of this hole? And Cairn Amroth Rangers having to retreat towards the Angmarim. I mean, so far, based on how chaotic it's getting, you would give an edge to the attackers. Based on past experiences. Throwing axes continuing to be utilised. Galadhrim Axeman still doing a good job. I mean, Angmar now, as the battle has worn on, they're also going to try and do what Isengard have done and anchor themselves in position on the hill with their pikes. Lothlorien do have a bit of support in reserve, however, that can hit them, so we'll have to wait and see if that is effective or not. Meanwhile, Mordor over on this side continue their push forwards. There was a unit of Here EX standing in the way, but they got bowled over entirely by Mordor. And you can see Mirkwood and Rohan, I think, are now actually going to have to retreat this way. As much as this appears to be the capital building of the settlement, they're going to have to abandon it because they don't have enough nearby. Lords of the Mark charging in. A good opportunity to use all of this lance cavalry, actually, but you know, actually managing to finish off one of the Beasts of Gorgoroth there, as well as charge into and skewer one or two of the Blackguard of Barad-dûr. Not a devastating charge, but it will slow Mordor's momentum up just a little bit. Mirkwood Border Guard also still over here as well. Going to have to try and consolidate here, the defenders. Hit and run with the cavalry where they are able. Temple Executioners and Temple Guards still alive. I mean, it's a scary force that Mordor still have for a late game push. They still have some javelins back there, but it's mainly all of the heavy units they still have. It means if the defenders are not prepared, it can be a real issue for them. Lords of the Mark intermittently wavering, which is a worry. I mean, the loss of the general earlier on probably hasn't helped things, but you'd expect a little bit more from some of the best that Rohan have to offer on horseback than to panic just because of the loss of the general. the sort of thing you'd expect from Eastmark units and regular troops, but not them. Galathrim riders. And over here, the main Rohan infantry force has also been dealt with, so Isengard and Mordor claiming some big territorial gains over on this half of the map. Probably the more constricting part of the map as well, certainly for Adin's army. And now, are they going to consolidate themselves over here? 2 good choke points, 2 gates that can be used to good effect. Trolls of Angmar moving forward once again, but again you can see the effects that the Elven shock infantry is having on them. The Sindar Blade Masters tearing them down pretty quickly. Guardians of Khan Doom on the front line, but as much as they are a solid unit of line infantry, they are very defensive in nature. The Galathrim Axemen's offensive edge and Elven finesse surely going to be enough for them to gain yet another small but very necessary victory at this point for the defenders. Trump Scourge Raiders throwing their payloads as well, doing their best to inflict just a little more damage. Galathrim Archers, also Galathrim Nobles, still a good unit to have in the late game. Lorien still with Kindred of Caliborn and the like. Poison projectiles from the standard Lorien archers could be useful against orcs as the battle goes along. I mean, this front line is completely restabilised again. Angmar stopped dead in their tracks really now by Lothlorien. The real threat to Lorien, I think, though, is going to come from Isengard over here. They've got still more room to work with as Nick MMK. Try and make the battle as wide as possible. Don't allow that elven quality to be used in its best possible way. It's whether or not the elves actually have enough. I mean, you can see here the quality of the Galathrim Axemen. They're doing a really good job, even though they are outnumbered by Guards of Orthanc and Uruk-hai infantry. Both units that are not bad in terms of quality either, upper mid-tier, or just upper tier in the case of the Guards of Orthanc, and yet the elves, blow for blow, still doing very, very well for themselves. Uruk-hai archers getting obviously ripped apart by Kindred of Caliborn in melee. There's also a few poison arrows finding their way forwards as well. And come Sindar Blade Masters. So, I mean, the Isengard Ballista's on the way forward, which is going to be a cause of concern for the defenders. A few good hits from that and it might put the battle beyond them. Defeat seems certain for the Uruk-hai pikes, but they're not properly in melee just yet. Lorien archers continue to loop their shots. Defeat is almost a certainty for the Guards of Orthanc still, which is amazing. The Nazkai, meanwhile, 28 of them. They are taking hits, however, otherwise I would back them against the Galathrim Axemen, but unsurprisingly, Lorien marking them out as one of the main causes of concern. More Uruk-hai pikemen marching into place. The Uruk-hai pikemen in general have been a real fixture in this battle. Galathrim archers. Tron pikemen. Barrow-wights. Still keeping the flame lit for Angmar over there. What's over here? So where are they going to choose their stand to be? I mean, here? These 2 choke points. Mordor and Isengard now going to be able to muster a completely joint effort. Still these Beasts of Gorgoroth. I mean, 1 or 2 we saw fall. 1 skewered by the Lords of the Mark off of a charge, but we are into the final 10,000 frames now. The sharp end, as it were, and they are actually going to retreat a little bit further, try and make the battlefield a little bit smaller. Are they going to use this ring structure over here to hold? I mean, to make the battlefield smaller is a good idea. It means you can reinforce where necessary a little bit easier. Interestingly though, the cavalry being over here, where once the space was Isengard's ally, now that these Elder Pathfinders are over here trying to get some charges, it may prove to not be the case. So It may end up being that in 2 positions the attackers won the initial fight, and in 2 the defenders will. The margins of which will play a big part in the battle in its final phase. Cairn Amroth Rangers nearby. Yeah, Isengard simply have too much left to do since the collapse of Angmar. And that is going to be the end of them, and Lothlorien then will be able to turn their full attention over there. I mean, that is the key as well. I think if Isengard and Angmar have been completely vanquished over here, Rohan and Mirkwood at the very least were able to salvage some of their units from their fights initially. Could that end up being a key factor? Elder Pathfinders charging in. Now, there's quite a few Uruk-hai pikemen. I mean, they won't go down too easily. Angmar still have a presence, but they're not really making any kind of inroads. The Caras Galadon's Guardians have had constant support for their efforts. I mean, the Witchram Hammerguard is still here, so Angmar maybe are not completely down for the count just yet. As long as they can maintain a little bit of a presence, it will be to Mordor and Isengard on the other side of the field's great benefit. Will they be able to get into range without those pikes keeping them at bay? However, Galathrun Riders still alive in spite of their early game struggles against those wargs where they got caught out a little bit. They've been able to flit around, doing a bit of damage with their Silverthorn arrows where and when they can. I mean, they need to be a little bit careful here. I mean, they are shortening the battlefield, but this choke point surely has to be the one they stick to. Forward come the Lords of the Mark. Is this going to be enough? I mean, landing a few hits on the Beasts of Gorgoroth, but only one of the Rohan riders fell as a result of that. It wasn't really a charge though. I mean, the problem is when you charge into a unit, it often homes in on the centre mass, which when they're spread out like that, it wasn't the unit on the edge. They were going to try and charge into the middle, which kind of works against what Rohan were trying to do there, I think. Elven King's Guard forming up the initial front line. Mordor and Isengard's continued march. Further afield. There goes an Isengard general. That is the first attacking general to fall, I think, actually. Guards of Orthanc being dealt with. The ballista never really came to fruition. Very good news for the defenders, especially given its position. I mean, the defenders choosing their last stand to be over here, the Isengard ballista could have demolished them as a result of that. Lothlorien archers looping their shots. And over here the Witchram pikemen now gaining the upper hand for Angmar. That's worrying for Lothlorien. Their own pikes were the centre of their defence over here, and there's simply not enough of them anymore. I mean, point blank shots from the Galathrun Riders are all well and good. Oh, we don't want to do that. That's going to result in many of them getting skewered. I think that was a case of Medieval 2's mechanical stickiness when it comes to cavalry. Like they got close enough so the unit kind of stuck to them. It's a weird thing that Medieval 2 does sometimes. I don't think that was a willing charge. Meanwhile, Sindar Blade Masters are coming in, going to try and catch the pikemen when they're out of formation. The armour will help them even in this situation, but if you can disrupt a pikeman unit's formation, their stats, their base stats, are simply not good enough, especially in comparison to something like Elven Swordsmen, who have some of the best baseline stats as far as a unit class goes. I'm going to try and push forward immediately here, Tommy, with his Blackguard of Barad-dûr, but I don't know, they're shaken. They're taking hits from throwing axes. The Shield Maidens are there. The Elven King's Guard will do good amounts of damage, and they rout. Maybe a little bit too early there. Maybe lead the way with the beasts and then move in with the Blackguard of Barad-dûr. It may not prove to be all that important in the long run. We'll have to wait and see what the overall outcome is. I mean, the Beasts of Gorgoroth are dropping like flies now. They have been involved in the battle for quite a while at this point, so their hit points drying up. Forward come the beasts once more. into the infantry blob in support. I mean, this is all well and good, but I don't think they're going to actually achieve all that much. The initial front line is now in chaos, however, so a little bit more ground has been made by the attackers, though it has cost them maybe a little bit more than they would have liked. Here land. Kindred also moving in. Temple Executioners. Again, a good unit which can go toe to toe with most of what the elves have to offer. This is already going to prove to be kind of an all or nothing engagement at this point. The attackers building to a fever pitch and just throwing everything in. The defender's going to have to meet this challenge, because if this position gets compromised, they're not going to have the ability to hold them at bay. Red shields being used as regular archers, shield maidens, 2 units of them. The fact that they're still here and probably still have most of their ammunition is going to be a big deal as long as this front line can hold. If they keep the attackers bottled up, that kind of damage will be absolutely invaluable. Temple Guard doing the same, however. The other engagement trying to swamp Angmar, trying to crush them so they only have one position to focus on here. Lorien, Elder Pathfinders charging through. They'll take a bit of damage from the cavalry, but I think they're trying to panic them in terms of morale, and the Witchram Pikemen are wavering and broken, so it worked. They took some losses, but it worked. And now the Hammer Guard will be the only thing left alive, but with the nobles in close proximity and these numbers, Angmar will finally be brought to heel. Angmar probably struggled the most out of all the attackers today, but they have kept themselves going in typical Angmar fashion with that resilience of theirs. But now, this really is the engagement to decide the battle, this one line against line engagement. We may see the Elder Pathfinders flank around and start causing some problems in behind enemy lines. Red shields and shield maidens. There goes the Angmar general. Kind of a moot point at this stage, but dead nonetheless. Shield maidens continuing. I mean, the upside here for the attackers is that they certainly have the advantage when it comes to pikes, so if all of this support runs its ammunition supply dry, they should be able to rely upon such units. Elder Council, shield maidens. Also, I mean, it's not as if the attackers are devoid of support either. Snaga, Orc Javelins, still some crossbows as well, Uruk-hai archers. I'm kind of surprised the crossbows are not up there, to be honest. Able to shoot down in, but sometimes you just got to move units as quickly as you can to get them into place, and at this stage I would say you just need the crossbows firing. So leave them in place and keep them shooting their payload downrange. Elder Council. Shield maidens as well. Taking some heavy losses, not able to really get up. They're getting thrown all over the place. And yeah, there are the Elder Pathfinders getting in behind, and they and the Galathrim Riders will be sufficient to start taking away the attackers' support, which is looking like it might be more and more important actually to the defenders' chances of winning. There's one champion of the White Hound remaining. I actually didn't see them in the battle at all, so I wonder what killed them off. Still the Uruk-hai making a real nuisance of themselves, these trolls so difficult to deal with. Pushing forward as the spearhead of things, and then the pikes from Isengard following them in. The real question is if they can withstand the damage coming from all of these elven curved swords. It's going to be a lot coming their way. But also a flank, maybe an opportunity. There's only 21 of these Blackguard of Barad-dûr, so maybe not much of an opportunity after all. And the announcer, though, is feeling pretty good about the defenders' chances now, and that may be as a result of the quality they have still within their lines. Still a bit of Mirkwood in there. Galathrim nobles. I think there's 2 units of Galathrim nobles. And the cavalry still buzzing around in the back line. Lords of the Mark, Galathrim Riders. 2 units of the Lothlorien Riders. Yeah, the individual quality here might just be too much for the attackers to bear. Will the elves' high-end stuff be enough to see them over the line in what has been a bloody affair? And I think the attackers in the middle of this game would have been feeling pretty good about themselves. Transitional phases forced. That's usually where the attackers can start to build some real momentum, but the defenders have managed to get themselves back into it here. And it was over on this side of the battlefield. I think Lothlorien in particular, the kind of performances their units put in ended up being extremely important, as it turns out. But will it be enough in the long run? I mean, the red shields now out of ammunition with their bows, so being used as a bludgeon now, causing the Snaga skirmishers unsurprisingly to rout, though you won't be able to do such to the Temple Executioners, and they will. Oh, there goes the other Lothlorien general, squashed by one of the Olag High's mighty hammers. Careening through, however, getting into the javelins. I mean, the Orc javelins are technically spears in melee, but they are so poor in melee that you would expect them to just be run down here. 3% the difference. Victory seems certain for them, but I mean, surely not. The Olag High will surely be brought down soon. All of these elven two-handers nearby. I find it hard to believe that they'll be able to withstand this for too much longer. Starting to flee now, are they, the attackers? That must have been something that remained of one of Angmar or the other Isengard army. Rohan still with a few units left, a few shield maidens, a few Helmingas, offering a bit of support to their elven allies. Still 6 Olag High left standing in the face of such threats. I mean, the red shields actually did still have a bit of ammunition, they just wanted to shoot from this side, which is fair enough. Still some Lothlorien riders left. Red shields firing in. Surely enough to cause these guys to rout pretty quickly. All that remains of the attacker support now being cut away, and that means it's going to be largely a case of finishing off what remains of the pikes, the Black Númenóreans, and the trolls that were part of the up-front melee push. And an interesting battle this. I have to say, I thought the attackers were going to go on to be a little bit more dominant in the late game, but fair play to the defenders here, they've managed to do good work. Defeat seems certain, only a military genius could win this battle. It looks like that is going to be that. As they flood through. The trolls may be some of the last ones left standing. I mean, the Olag High certainly merits their title now as strongest trolls in the game, which, considering how strong they now are, is quite the accolade to have, but it's not going to be enough for one troll alone to turn this battle on its head any longer. And there we go. I don't know what the last unit left alive is going to be. Ah, Nazgul. Yeah, they were at the centre of things. It's the first time I've actually seen them in this battle, so that's a sign really that Tommy was using them well, because they were right in the middle of things. Although, admission of defeat there. Maybe that Nazgul will slip away. Maybe he won't. But a good victory here for the defenders, especially considering it, like I said, it wasn't looking amazing for them in the mid-game, and that's always a little bit of a problem. You can see, though, how Angmar did struggle. I mean, usually we're used to seeing Angmar be pretty domineering on the attack, but that wasn't the case today. They split their focus a little bit, and Lothlorien did a very good job, I think, at stopping them. The only slight downside was maybe the loss of some of those Galadhrim nobles at the hands of those wargs, but other than that, Angmar weren't really able to affect anything going forwards. And indeed, Nick MMK did a pretty good job in the initial wide choke point, but in the second one, where more reinforcements were there, it was, you know, he had a little bit more trouble perhaps, and the arrival of the cavalry certainly didn't help, but we'll never know what the outcome would have been without that. Adin did well against the Rohan force, as you would kind of expect. I mean, Rohan, when they dig into a position, they don't have phalanx units to really anchor themselves in place. They do have some pretty nasty range support tools, and some of their infantry can be pretty good as like a defensive unit, but also being quite aggressive, like the Westmark Marshals with their armor piercing. But yeah, I mean, for the Warlord, it was going to be interesting to see how Rohan dealt with Isengard when Rohan had to dig in. Initially okay, but you know, as the battle wore on, Adin made the right kind of calls, as did Tommy. You know, good aggression early on, and then when the time came, committing forward an awful lot, and that was enough to break the initial Mirkwood defensive line that Hidden had laid on. But not quite enough from those two in the late game to be able to finish off the defenders on the other side. I mean, like I said, Mirkwood and Rohan salvaging some of their units for that engagement in the late game may well prove to have been very, very important, because by the time Mordor and Isengard were beginning their assault, the other Isengard army and Angmar were largely, if not completely, defeated, and that proved to be pretty important. So let's see what did the damage for Lothlorien, probably the most important units or armies on the field, considering how well they were able to do. 288 on the Kindred of Celeborn, combination of throwing axes and their abilities in melee. Galadhrim Riders doing okay. Lorien Bladesmen, standard units, doing quite well for themselves initially against those Isengard forces in the wider sections. Galadhrim Warriors with the armour piercing, and the Lorien Spearmen breaking 200 kills is very impressive, to be fair, against the kind of foes they were up against. Archers, of course, doing very well for themselves, as you would expect. In this kind of battle, it's always going to be important for the defenders to use their archers well. And then T.S. Niehoff, 295 on his Galadhrim Riders, that's pretty good. Pretty much everything breaking 100, a few exceptions to that rule, but not too many. Guardians of Caras Galadhon, very important against Angmar as well. One of the main reasons for the, you know, just complete stop that Angmar were suffering was the fact that the Guardians of Caras Galadhon were at the centre of that Lothlorien defence, so worth every bit of their high price tag on this occasion. And yeah, a good performance this. I think Lothlorien, you know, the main takeaway from this battle is how effective Lothlorien can be as a faction, with that combination of elven skill, good armour, and also the damage they're capable of kicking out. It's a really potent mix, and it's enough, if you have your composition correct, to be able to stop factions like Angmar and Isengard dead in their tracks, even when they've got a lot of, you know, heavy duty mass on their side. But yeah, an interesting one this, and the second battle in a row that we're seeing a really good performance by an elven-led defence. I'm sure that everyone will be pretty pleased with that. So yeah, big thank you to Dabo for sending this one in. Big thanks to all the players for being a part of this battle replay. I'm not sure who made this map off the top of my head, but this is of course one that we haven't seen before. As far as what's going to be coming up next, I have been given something pretty cool, which is the revamped version of Khan Doom, made by WK, so that's going to be another sort of set piece classic siege map, which we'll be able to see. I did actually join a match on that quite a while ago, like 2 months ago at this point, but the frame rate was appalling. I think that because something was up on that map, but I think that's been resolved, and we will be able to see a battle on that. So that will be the next Reforged battle coming out midweek. There will be another Silmarillion one, and going on further from that, there will be a few more Reforged replays that we have, which will see us through until the beginning of 2024. And of course, before that, there will be, around Christmas, New Year, there will be a channel update video as well, explaining a much needed explanation really about what the plan is going into the next year, and some of the downsides to what this year has brought, and you know, just some general information which I think is fairly important given how things have gone. But yeah, that like I said, that'll probably be towards the tail end of December, so probably about 4 or so weeks away still, following the release of, well, 3 or 4 weeks following the release of this video, probably in the midweek slot as well. Depending upon when Christmas falls, of course, probably won't be releasing a video on Christmas Day, but yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Everything is subject to change, of course, at this stage of the year. Yeah, once again, big thanks to all the players. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.